I just want to go into more detail about the effects of playing at altitude and how it affects traditional football players, soccer players in general. Let me give you more details on the sea level and how a city is considered to be a high altitude city, how it's considered to be mile high status. So a city that's in high altitude is any location that is above 2,400 feet. Any city or town or county, any location that is above 2,400 feet, 2,400 feet, that is high altitude. Anything above that. So when it comes to MLS towns, USL towns, you have Salt Lake City, 4,226 feet high. You have Denver, 5,280 feet high. And you got Colorado Springs, 5,994 feet high. You got Albuquerque, 5,312 feet high. Then you got El Paso, 3,740 feet high. Those are the MLS and the USL altitude towns. And the thing that makes it difficult, makes it challenging for the visiting teams to play in these cities, to play in these locations is the thin air. When you're playing in altitude, the air decreases. Like the National Geographic Society, like on their website, they gave a good definition. Like they gave a good explanation. And it says, as altitude increases, the amount of gas molecules in the air decreases. The air becomes less dense than the air nearer to sea level. So that's what the meteorologists and the mountaineers mean by thin air. Like the thin air exerts less pressure than air at lower altitude. So the air is less dense. That's why it's harder to breathe. That's why it's harder to breathe when you're in high altitude compared to normal sea level. Like that's why it's hard to breathe when you're in a location that's above 2,400 feet rather than the regular air quality that's within 2,400 feet or a little lower than such. Athletes that spend a lot of time in these locations, that play for these teams that's in these locations, they have enough time to get acclimated with the quality of air, the lack of. It takes time for you to get acclimated to it. The visiting teams who are dealing with a regular season schedule, they don't have that much time. And for the visiting teams, they only spend either a day or two, or some even a few hours before the actual game start. Like if there's a game scheduled in one of these cities, like the visiting team only come a day or two before the actual game starts, the actual kickoff time for the game starts. And that's not good, because you need more than, for most people, you need more than a few hours. You need more than a few days to get acclimated with the altitude. And this is why teams in these locations, they have a competitive advantage. They have the ultimate home field advantage than anyone else because of this. And it's worse on NBA players, because the NBA travel schedule is you're constantly on the road. You're constantly on the move. And a lot of times in the NBA, you do back-to-back matchups. Like you play a game in, let's say you play a game in Minnesota one night, and then the following night, you have to travel to Denver. And then after Denver, you go to Salt Lake City. So it's tough. And this is why teams that play in these cities, not only MLS, but teams that play in these cities, they generally play better than the other teams. But usually usually come playoff time, these teams usually get exposed because playoff time, teams generally, they can travel to the altitude like a week in advance before the game starts. They have enough time to get acclimated to the altitude. Or if these altitude teams, they have to travel on the road, it's an even playing field now. So when they travel on the road, that's when you really get to see how good or bad they are. It's kind of hard for you to judge how good or bad they are when they're at home because of that home field advantage. So that's why when they travel on the road, that's when you should really start paying more attention to these teams. For example, you see how the Denver Nuggets so far in the playoffs been playing poorly against Golden State. Now, as the series shifts to Denver, I won't be surprised if the Denver Nuggets win Game 3 of that playoff game against the Golden State Warriors because they're back in altitude. But these first 2 games on the Golden State-Denver series, you truly get to see what the Nuggets are really about because they're not playing in altitude. The same for the Utah Jazz. These first 2 games against the Mavericks, we have truly been able to see what kind of team they are because they're not playing in altitude. And as you can see with both of these 2 teams, the Nuggets and the Jazz, they don't look as dominant on the road compared to how they look at home. So based on how they play on the road, that's how you figure out what kind of team they truly are. And on the road, they look like an average team. And in actuality, they most likely are average NBA teams. And the reason why they were top 5 seeds in the NBA Western Conference is because that home field altitude advantage. If they weren't playing in altitude, there most likely would have been play-in teams, like the bottom seeds of the West. So now as we come now in comparison to the MLS, MLS is different from NBA and NFL. You don't have a lot of timeouts in the MLS. You don't have 4 quarters in the MLS. In the MLS and the USL, you're constantly moving your body. You're constantly running up and down the field, constantly changing directions. So playing in altitude for a soccer team is much tougher than a rugby style football, NFL team, college football team, and an NBA team. It's much tougher to play soccer in altitude for the visiting team than it is for any other sport. Maybe hockey's on that same level too as soccer because hockey, they're constantly moving, but hockey also got 3 quarters. So hockey players, they get a break. The only real break that MLS players get is halftime. That's it. So that's why, if a player fakes an injury and he's rolling on the ground at a game in Commerce City, Colorado, or Salt Lake City, Utah, it's not really because he's injured. He's probably just trying to catch his breath from the high altitude. But let me also give you some more details about playing in altitude. There's also the dry climate element. Like the Mountain West in general, the climate is very dry. Now, Denver, Salt Lake City, and Albuquerque is not as hot as El Paso, or southern New Mexico, that area. But the climate is still dry. So not only you have to deal with shortness of breath, not only you have to deal with lack of oxygen, there's also a lack of H2O. You need more H2O, you need more water because of the dry climate and you're constantly moving. So that's another element. That's something else that you got to balance. You got to balance the oxygen, then you got to balance the dehydration in your body. Like you're constantly running up and down the field, but you're not really breaking any sweat. Then there's also the red blood count, the red blood cell count. When you're in high altitude, your red blood cell count increases. This can lead to many things, such as weak muscles, tightness in your chest, which is also due to lack of oxygen, tightness in your chest, dizziness, fatigue, joint pain, and sleep disturbance. It's pretty hard for you to sleep at night when you're in high altitude. So there's a lot of advantages for the Colorado, Utah, and the USL teams that play in altitude. It's way more than just the oxygen. They have way more of an advantage. This is why I stated in my other video that when these teams play on the road, that's when you will truly know what they're about. That's why I put emphasis on these teams winning on the road, because if they don't win on the road, it doesn't show that they're a true contender. They got the home field advantage because they play in high altitude. So they're always going to look good in high altitude because they are acclimated to that kind of climate. So whatever sport, this doesn't only apply to traditional football, but whatever other sport you're interested in and you're watching, and you see a team that's a high altitude team and they look good at home, wait until they go on the road before you judge whether or not they're good or bad. How they play on the road will truly determine how good or bad they really are. Because when you're playing in altitude, it's not an even playing field for the visiting team. But when that altitude team travels to a location where it's low altitude or it's just even, it's at or near 2,400 feet above sea level, well, that's when we will truly know what they're truly about, whether or not they're good or bad, because that's the even level playing field. So my suggestion to MLS teams, if this is possible, because I know like y'all got MLS teams in general, they got a busy schedule with CONCACAF tournament, FIFA tournaments, US Open tournaments. We got the Liga MX tournament coming up next year, the League Cup. There's just so many cups going on through the regular season. But if possible, MLS teams, whenever you play an altitude team, whenever you play Salt Lake or Colorado, if there's a possible way for you to travel to that location a week in advance before your game starts, like let's say like a team like NYCFC, let's say they had a home game at Yankee Stadium against Toronto. As soon as that game against Toronto ends, NYCFC either travels to Denver that same night or they travel to Denver the next day. So they'll have 5 to 6 days to get acclimated to the high altitude. So when they do play the Colorado Rapids or Real Salt Lake, the week after that Toronto game, that they'll be well prepared for the matchup. They won't deal with altitude sickness. Their bodies will be adjusted to the lack of oxygen. They'll be able to treat any ailments from a high red blood cell count. I believe that this is something that Bill Belichick used to do when Tom Brady was the quarterback for the Patriots. Like, I believe Bill Belichick used to do this, like, whenever there is a game against Denver the following week, like, let's say they played the Dolphins at home one week. Like, if there is a game against Denver the following week, like, as soon as that game against the Dolphins ended at the Foxborough Stadium, like, that either that same night or the next morning, they fly out to Colorado Springs or somewhere in the Denver area, and they spend that whole week there practicing in preparation for the Broncos game so they can be acclimated to the altitude. And I also believe that some NFL teams, I don't think it's a lot. I think few NFL teams, like, let's say they have 2 road games after a home game. So let's say if it's a team like the Pittsburgh Steelers, let's say they have a road game against Tennessee, and then that following week, they have another road game against Denver. So after that first road game against the Tennessee Titans, instead of going back to Pittsburgh after that Titans game, they fly straight to Denver and spend the whole week in Denver leading up to that Broncos game so they can be acclimated to the altitude. I think if MLS teams can do something like that, I think it will help even the playing field. So the altitude teams won't have such of a big home field advantage. Like if NYCFC, let's say they have 2 back-to-back road games, like they have a road game in Atlanta, and then the following week they have a road game in Salt Lake City. So they play their first road game in Atlanta, and as soon as that road game ends in Atlanta, instead of them going back to New York, they go to Salt Lake. And they spend a week in Salt Lake to get acclimated to the altitude in preparation for the game against Real Salt Lake. So that when they do play Real Salt Lake, it will be an even playing field. They'll be able to treat any potential ailments that the players are going through as a result of the lack of oxygen, as a result of the high red blood cell count. I think if MLS teams do something like that more often, if possible, I think it will help and it'll even the playing field, level playing field. So that's that about playing at altitude. Hopefully you're able to gain some knowledge and I was able to educate you a little bit. But do some research on your own too, because this is a very interesting topic.